Eleanor Vance decided that the colour of despair was grey. It was the flat, unforgiving grey of the November sky pressing down on the carriage roof, the worn grey of her own woolen gloves, and the oppressive, monumental grey of Blackwood Manor, as it rose from the mist like a forgotten headstone. Her life had been stripped of its colour, leaving only this muted resignation. She was no longer Miss Vance, daughter of a respected, albeit debt-ridden gentleman. She was Nora, a temporary housekeeper, a ghost hired to drift through the halls of a man who was himself little more than a rumour. She had no idea anyone was watching. He had been watching from the moment she arrived. From the shadows of the upper gallery, Duke Alaric Beaumont observed the new arrival. She was the 17th woman his London agent had sent in 2 years. The others had been a blur of nervous giggles, brazen ambition, or wilting fear. They lasted, on average, a day. This one was different. She stepped from the carriage not with a flourish or a shudder, but with a quiet, squared set to her shoulders, as if bracing against a wind only she could feel. Her gaze lifted to the imposing facade of his home, and for a moment he saw not awe or intimidation, but a flicker of something analytical, something that assessed the stone and slate for what it was, a problem to be endured. Eleonora clutched her small valise, the handle digging into her palm. The air was cold, smelling of wet earth and ancient stone. Inside, the great hall was a cavern of shadows and silence. Her footsteps echoed on the marble floor, each sound an intrusion. A stern, rail-thin woman, with hair pulled into a knot of iron grey, approached her. This was Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, whose reputation for severity had reached even the lowly employment agency in the city. "Miss Vance," the woman said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "You are late by 10 minutes. "My apologies," Eleonora murmured, her own voice feeling small in the cavernous space. "The road was poor." Mrs. Gable gave a curt nod, a gesture that dismissed the excuse without acknowledging it. "Your duties will be light for now. You will be assigned to the East Wing, dusting, polishing, and ensuring the linens are turned. You will not enter the Duke's private wing. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will be invisible. Is that understood?" "Perfectly," Eleonora said. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. To be invisible was what she had become since her father's death. A phantom in her own former life. Here it was merely a condition of her employment. Alaric watched from above as Mrs. Gable led the new girl away. He noted the straightness of her spine, the lack of fidgeting. She did not glance around with wide-eyed wonder at the tapestries or the vaulted ceilings. Her focus was narrow, her purpose clear. She was here to work, to survive. It was a promising start. The days that followed fell into a monotonous rhythm. Eleonora learned the geography of the manor's silence. It was a house that held its breath. The staff moved like mice, communicating in whispers and gestures, terrified of disturbing the unseen master of the house, Duke Beaumont. They called him the Shadow Duke, a man who had inherited the title 2 years prior and had promptly sealed himself away from the world. No one ever saw him. His orders came via his steward, the pompous and perpetually irritated Mr. Finch. Eleonora found a strange solace in the work. The repetitive motion of polishing silver or dusting forgotten bookshelves allowed her mind to drift. She thought of her father, of the books they had read together, of the numbers he had taught her to love for their beautiful, unshakable logic. Numbers did not lie. They did not change their minds or run away from their debts. They were constant. Her diligence did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Gable's stern facade began to show microscopic cracks. One afternoon, she found Eleonora in the library, a room she had been assigned to air out, with a heavy book of architectural history open on her lap. Her finger traced the lines of a blueprint for a Palladian villa. "This room is to be aired, Miss Vance, not read in," Mrs. Gable said, though her voice lacked its usual cutting edge. Eleonora snapped the book shut, a flush rising on her cheeks. "Forgive me, the diagrams were compelling." Mrs. Gable looked at the book, then back at Eleonora. "The work in the East Wing is satisfactory. Mr. Finch requires assistance organizing the estate office. It has been neglected. He will consider it busy work. I will consider it a test. Do not disappoint me." The estate office was a testament to organized chaos. Ledgers were stacked in precarious towers, papers overflowed from drawers, and a fine layer of dust coated everything, suggesting it was a place of work in name only. Mr. Finch, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his waistcoat, pointed a thick finger at a desk piled high with account books. "Sort these," he grunted, not bothering to look at her. "Chronologically, and do not touch anything else." For 3 days, Eleonora worked in the dusty silence of the office. It was tedious, painstaking work, but as she handled the heavy, leather-bound ledgers, a familiar curiosity stirred within her. She began to see the story of the estate written in columns of figures. She saw the ebb and flow of its fortunes, the cost of harvests, the price of repairs, the wages of the staff. And then she saw the error. It was small, almost insignificant. A miscalculation in the quarterly tithe to the local parish, repeated every 3 months, year after year, for the last 5 years. A simple transposition of 2 numbers in a percentage. To a casual observer, it would be invisible. But to Eleonora, whose mind was trained to see patterns in numbers, it stood out like a blot of red ink on a pristine white page. She checked her calculations. Then she checked them again. There was no mistake. The estate had been overpaying, not by a fortune, but by a consistent, bleeding amount that, over half a decade, had accumulated into a sum that would have paid her own meager salary for a lifetime. Her first instinct was to report it. She would go to Mr. Finch and show him her findings, but she hesitated. She had seen the way the steward carried himself, the way he dismissed the other servants. He was a man who did not suffer being corrected, especially by a temporary housekeeper. To point out his mistake, for it was surely his signature scrawled at the bottom of each page, would be to invite his wrath. It would mean her dismissal. From his vantage point, a small, discreet observation slit carved into the wall of his adjoining private study, Alaric watched her. He had seen her discover the ledgers. He had seen her pause her sorting and retrieve a spare sheet of paper and a pencil. For hours she had sat hunched over the desk, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched as her eyes widened in discovery, followed by a quick, sharp intake of breath. Now he watched her struggle with what she had found. This was the true test. Competence was one thing, integrity was another entirely. Eleonora made her decision. She could not simply ignore it. The logic of the numbers demanded correction, but she would not confront the steward. Instead, she took a fresh ledger, one intended for the new year, and began the arduous task of recopying the last 5 years of accounts. She did it quietly, methodically, during the hours she was supposed to be sorting. In her new version, the error was corrected. The final tallies were different. She did not make a show of it. She simply placed the corrected ledger at the bottom of the pile she was organizing, with the flawed ones stacked neatly on top. Her correction was a silent one, a whisper of truth waiting to be found by someone who cared to look. She finished her work late one evening. The manor was deep in its slumbering silence. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, a small, private smile. She had solved the puzzle. That was reward enough. As she was leaving the office, her eyes fell upon a bookshelf that held not ledgers, but texts on agricultural science and land management. On the corner of a desk, separate from the others, lay a slim volume. It was a treatise on advanced calculus. It looked new, the spine uncracked. It seemed entirely out of place. Driven by a curiosity that outweighed her caution, she picked it up. A floorboard creaked in the hall. Eleonora froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was not supposed to be here so late. She quickly placed the book back on the desk and slipped out of the office, melting back into the shadows of the corridor. Alaric stepped back from the observation slit. He had left the book there himself that afternoon, a deliberate breadcrumb. He had wanted to see if she would notice it, if her intellect was as broad as it was deep. She had not only noticed it, she had held it with a look of longing, a hunger for knowledge that he recognized in himself. A feeling he had not identified in years began to stir in his chest. It was not just approval. It was a profound and unsettling sense of connection. The next morning, the storm broke. Mr. Finch, for reasons Eleonora could not fathom, had decided to look at the ledgers himself. Perhaps he had noticed her long hours in his office and grown suspicious. Whatever the reason, he had found her corrected version. His roar echoed from the office, and a footman was sent to fetch her with an urgency that spoke of dire trouble. Eleonora walked towards the office, her stomach a cold, tight knot. She found the steward standing behind his desk, his face a mottled purple. He held her corrected ledger in his hand, shaking it as if it were a venomous snake. Several other servants, including Mrs. Gable, were gathered in the doorway, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. "What is the meaning of this?" Finch bellowed, slamming the book down on the desk. The sound cracked like a whip. "You were told to sort these, not to deface them with your nonsensical scribblings." Eleonora stood before him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to still their trembling. "I've found an error, sir," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "A recurring miscalculation. I took the liberty of correcting it." "Liberty?" he sneered, his jowls quivering with rage. "You are a housekeeper. Your job is to handle a dust rag, not the accounts of this estate. You have overstepped your station in the most audacious manner. You are arrogant and insolent." "The numbers are not arrogant, Mr. Finch," she replied, a spark of her father's defiant intellect flaring within her. "They are simply correct. The tithe was calculated at 3.5% instead of 3.05%. If you check the original charter—" "I will not!" he shouted, cutting her off. He was losing control, his fury fueled by the public humiliation of his mistake being exposed. He pointed a trembling finger at the door. "You are dismissed. I want you out of this house within the hour. Get her out of my office." The other servants flinched. Mrs. Gable took a half-step forward, a look of distress on her face, but she was powerless against the steward. Eleonora felt the floor drop out from beneath her. It was over. Her one chance, squandered by her own inability to leave a problem unsolved. The grey was closing in again. A voice, calm and cold as a frozen lake, spoke from the doorway behind her. "She stays." Every person in the room froze. The voice was not loud, but it carried an authority that eclipsed the steward's blustering rage. Eleonora turned slowly. A man stood there, half concealed by the shadows of the hall. He was tall and lean, dressed in simple dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light around him. But it was his face that held her captive. It was a study in severe angles and quiet intensity, with eyes the color of a winter storm. She had never seen him before, yet she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, exactly who he was. The Shadow Duke, Alaric Beaumont. He stepped fully into the room, his presence shrinking the space until it seemed only he, Eleonora, and the sputtering steward existed. The other servants melted away, disappearing back into the woodwork of the manor. Alaric's gaze was fixed, not on Finch, but on her. Your Grace, Finch stammered, his face draining of all color. He bowed low, a clumsy, panicked gesture. I was just... This woman, she was... I heard, the Duke said, his voice cutting off the steward's babbling. He walked past Eleonora and picked up the ledger from the desk. He flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustle of paper. Finally, he looked up, his gaze landing on the steward like a physical weight. You have managed my father's estate for 20 years, Finch. Yes, Your Grace, with utmost loyalty, Finch said, sweat beading on his forehead. Your loyalty appears to be exceeded only by your incompetence, the Duke stated flatly. This error has cost my estate thousands of pounds. An error you either failed to notice or chose to ignore. Which is it? The steward opened and closed his mouth like a landed fish. No sound came out. Pack your belongings, the Duke said, his tone leaving no room for argument. My solicitor will meet you in the village to settle your final accounts. You are no longer in my employ. Finch stared, his face a mask of disbelief and horror, before he seemed to crumble in on himself. He gave a jerky nod and scurried from the room, a man utterly broken. The Duke turned his attention back to Eleonora. She stood rigid, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She had felled the mighty Steward, but surely her own execution was next. Miss Vance, he said. Her name on his lips sounded strange, formal and yet personal. Follow me. He led her from the office, through corridors she had never seen, into the forbidden West Wing. The air here was different, smelling of old paper, lemon oil, and something faintly masculine, like leather and cloves. He opened a heavy oak door and gestured for her to enter. It was a study, but unlike the chaotic estate office, this room was a masterpiece of order. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, not for show, but with the well-worn look of constant use. A massive desk stood before a tall window that looked out over the bleak but beautiful moors. Please, he said, indicating a leather chair opposite the desk. Sit. She did as she was told, perching on the edge of the seat. He did not sit behind the desk, creating a barrier between them. Instead, he leaned against the front of it, crossing his arms over his chest. He regarded her with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. Explain to me how you found the error, he said. It was not an accusation, but a genuine question. Finding her voice, she detailed her process, explaining the logic of the numbers, the pattern of the mistake, the charter she had cross-referenced in the archives. She spoke with the clarity and passion she had once reserved for conversations with her father. As she spoke, she saw a flicker of something in his expression, not surprise, but confirmation. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. My father, he began, his voice softer now, laced with a weariness that seemed to go beyond his years, was a good man, but a terrible administrator. He trusted too easily. When he died, he left me a title, a mountain of debt, and a staff whose loyalties and competencies were a complete mystery. I suspected mismanagement, even theft, but I had no proof. Finch was my father's man. To challenge him directly would have been to put the entire staff on the defensive. I would never have found the truth. He pushed himself off the desk and began to pace before the window. So, I began an experiment. I instructed my agent to send me temporary staff for various positions. I watched them. I tested them. Most were interested only in the prestige of the house or the potential for gossip. They saw the surface of things. They did their work, poorly or adequately, and they left. I've been testing every person sent to this house for 2 years, Miss Vance. He stopped and turned to face her. The grey light from the window framed him, making him seem even more like a creature of shadow and substance. "You were the first one I did not dismiss within a day," he said. "You were the first to look beneath the surface. You found a problem, and you fixed it, not for praise, not for reward, but because it was illogical for it to remain broken. You did not come running to me or to the steward to curry favor. You simply did the work." Eleonora was speechless. Her entire world had been turned upside down. This cold, reclusive duke was not hiding from the world out of arrogance or madness. He was fighting a silent, lonely war to save his own home. He was a man drowning in responsibility, unable to trust anyone. I was only doing my job," she finally managed to whisper. "No," he said, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You were doing mine." He walked to his desk and picked up a piece of paper. It was a letter of employment. "Finch's position is now vacant, as is the position of my personal secretary, an office that has been empty for far too long. The work will be demanding. You will be helping me untangle 2 decades of neglect. You will be my partner in restoring this estate to solvency and order." He held the letter out to her. "The salary is 5 times what you are currently earning. You will have rooms in this wing. You will answer to no one but me. I am not offering you a position as a housekeeper, Miss Vance. I am offering you a position of trust." Eleonora stared at the letter, then at his outstretched hand. This was impossible. A woman of her station offered such a role. It defied all convention. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw no deception. She saw a profound loneliness, a desperate need for an ally, and she saw respect. He was looking at her, truly seeing her, for the first time since her father had died. The grey was receding. A sliver of colour, fragile but persistent, was beginning to dawn on the horizon of her life. "I accept," she said, her voice stronger now. She took the letter from his hand, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. A strange current, like a spark of static electricity, passed between them. It was a jolt of recognition, of 2 solitary minds finding a sudden, unexpected kinship. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of focused, relentless work. Eleonora, or Nora, as he had begun to call her in the privacy of the study, was given full access to the estate's affairs. Together, she and Duke Beaumont, Alaric, pored over maps, deeds, tenant agreements, and endless columns of figures. She discovered he possessed a mind as sharp and logical as her own. He was quick, decisive, and had an encyclopedic knowledge of his lands. But he had been trying to fight a war on 1,000 fronts all at once, alone. She became his strategist, organizing the chaos into manageable campaigns. They worked late into the nights, the study filled with the soft scratch of her pen and the low murmur of his voice as they debated the merits of a new crop rotation or the renegotiation of a timber contract. The staff, initially wary of her sudden elevation, soon came to respect her. Her instructions were clear, her manner was fair, and under her quiet administration, the creaking, inefficient machinery of the manor began to run smoothly for the first time in years. In all this time, their interactions remained professional, courteous. Yet, an unspoken intimacy grew in the space between them. It was in the way he would have a fresh pot of tea brought for her when he saw her flagging, or the way she knew exactly which book he would need from the shelves before he asked for it. She learned the subtle shifts in his moods. A tightening of his jaw meant frustration. A particular stillness meant he was deep in thought. She began to see the man behind the ducal coronet. She saw the flicker of dry humor in his eyes when she made a witty observation. She saw the genuine concern on his face when he spoke of his tenants. One evening, he found her staring out the window at the gardens, which had been left to grow wild and untended. "My mother loved those gardens," he said, his voice quiet beside her. She spent all her time there. After she passed, my father couldn't bear to look at them. He let them go. It was the first time he had ever spoken of his family. She saw a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the lonely boy who had lost his mother and inherited a father's grief. "They could be beautiful again," she said softly. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "Yes," he said, "I believe they could." The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken meaning. It was about more than just gardens. It was about restoration, about bringing life back to a place that had been dormant for too long. Section. The turning point came during a bitter winter storm that snowed them in for nearly a week. A crisis arose concerning a collapsed roof at a tenant farm, and with travel impossible, Alaric grew increasingly agitated, pacing the study like a caged wolf. "The family has young children," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "They will be freezing, and I can do nothing." Nora watched him, seeing his helplessness as a physical pain. Without a word, she went to the kitchens. She organized the staff to pack supplies, blankets, food, firewood, onto a heavy-duty sledge from the stables. She consulted the oldest groomsman, who knew the land better than anyone, to find the most sheltered, passable route. When Alaric came looking for her, he found her in the courtyard, wrapped in a heavy cloak, directing the final preparations. "What is this?" he demanded, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You cannot go, Your Grace," she said, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "But your men can. We will not let them suffer just because the roads are closed." He stared at her, at the determined set of her jaw and the flush the cold had brought to her cheeks. He saw not an employee, but a leader, a partner. He reached out and took her arm, pulling her back from the biting wind, into the shelter of a stone archway. "Nora," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. He didn't let go of her arm. His gloved fingers were a warm, firm pressure. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they felt momentous. He looked down at her, and for the first time, she did not feel like his secretary or his housekeeper. She felt like his equal. The distance between them had vanished, consumed by the urgency of the moment and the simple, profound act of shared purpose. The wind howled around them, but in the small space they occupied, there was a sudden, breathless stillness. A year passed. Winter gave way to a tentative spring, which blossomed into a warm, productive summer. Blackwood Manor was transformed. The gardens were being slowly reclaimed from the wilderness. The accounts were balanced, the tenants were prosperous, and the house itself seemed to breathe again. Laughter was occasionally heard in the servants' hall. Alaric was transformed as well. The shadows had receded from his eyes, replaced by a calm confidence. He still rarely left the estate, but his reclusiveness no longer felt like a prison. It was a choice. His world was here, within these walls and across these lands, and it was a world he was now master of, thanks in no small part to the quiet, brilliant woman at his side. Their work continued, but the current of personal feeling running beneath it had grown too strong to ignore. It was in the lingering looks across the desk, the way their hands would brush when passing a document, the comfortable silences that fell between them as they watched the sunset from the study window. One evening in late autumn, he found her in the library. It had become her sanctuary, the one place she felt truly at peace. He stood in the doorway for a moment, simply watching her. She was tracing the constellations on an old celestial map, a small, contented smile on her face. "I came to this room 2 years ago," he said, his voice making her start. "I was a man lost in his own home. I was drowning." She turned to him, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. "You were not lost, Alaric. You were just alone." He walked towards her, stopping just before her. I am not alone anymore. He reached out, not to touch her, but to trace the same star she had been looking at on the map. I set a test, Nora. I was looking for a mind I could trust. I had no idea I would find a heart I could not live without. His confession hung in the air, as simple and as profound as a mathematical truth. She looked up at him, and all the unspoken words, all the shared glances and quiet moments of the past year coalesced into a single, overwhelming feeling. It was not the giddy infatuation of a girl, but the deep, steady love of a woman who had seen a man at his most vulnerable and respected him all the more for it. "I never knew I was being tested," she whispered. "It ceased to be a test the day you rewrote that ledger," he said, his gaze dropping to her lips. "From that moment on, it was simply waiting, hoping you would see me as I saw you." He finally closed the small space between them. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his touch both hesitant and certain. "I have restored my estate, Nora Vance, but it is still just a house. It is not a home. Not without you." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was soft and gentle, and filled with the quiet gratitude of two lonely souls who had finally found their counterpart. It tasted of old books and new beginnings. When he pulled away, he did not release her. He kept his hands on her cheeks, his thumbs stroking her skin. "There is a flaw in our arrangement," he said, a rare, true smile lighting his eyes. "My secretary cannot also be my duchess. The paperwork would be a nightmare. Therefore, I must ask you to resign from one position to accept the other. Marry me, Nora." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The grey had vanished completely, replaced by a future that was vibrant and full of colour. She was no longer invisible. She was seen. She was valued. She was loved. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, Alaric, I will." He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of profound relief, as if he had been holding it for 2 long years. He leaned his forehead against hers. They stood there for a long time in the quiet of the library, 2 partners, 2 equals, their new life stretching out before them like the infinite, star-filled map on the table. The manor was no longer a place of shadows, but a place of light, and its heart, once silent, had finally started to beat again.